Spider-Man Hostile Takeover, Chapter 13. The plan had been to meet Aunt May for breakfast, but Peter somehow managed to sleep through the alarm he set on his phone. When he called his aunt, she laughed and suggested to come to Feast, where she worked, and they could grab a quick coffee. This was exactly the sort of thing that left Peter feeling vaguely uneasy. His aunt had grown so used to his being unreliable. It hardly even registered with her that her nephew, the boy she had raised and treated like a son, really ought to show up on time. She had long decided he was flighty or distracted or a kooky science type. The truth was, Peter really wanted to be considered reliable. He wanted to be someone people trusted to honor his commitments. Unfortunately, when he didn't blow those commitments to fight a villain or rescue someone, it was because he was exhausted from living two incredibly demanding lives. It didn't take long to get from his apartment to the Feast shelter in Little Tokyo. When he walked through the door, he immediately heard his aunt's voice, talking in soothing tones. Her work at Feast was supposed to be administrative, but as with all charitable organizations, there were always more tasks than there were staff members, which meant everyone had to do whatever was needed at any given moment. In this case, Aunt May was talking down a homeless man in camouflage clothing and whose missing left leg meant he got around on crutches. They'd attracted a crowd, and several of the onlookers wore frightened expressions. Peter resisted the urge to rush in and stayed back to watch her in action. In doing so, he was reminded just how awesome his aunt could be. "Everyone has bad days, Steve," she was saying in a firm voice. "Everyone gets frustrated, and we're all tempted to take it out on the people who are trying to help us. But that doesn't make it right. Now, you owe this young man an apology for yelling at him." The man in camouflage turned to Harris, a clerical worker who usually affected hipster nerdiness. At the moment, though, behind his impossibly chunky glasses, he wore an expression that combined fear of a man in camo with awe at Aunt May for taking control of the situation. I'm truly sorry, young fellow," the man said in a rumbling bass voice. It practically rattled the windows, but it was still full of contrition. He leaned on one of the crutches and removed his hat. I sometimes have a problem with my temper, but I ought not to have spoken to you as I did." "Now," Aunt May said, "let me show you where you can get something to eat. And while you do that, Harris here will review the paperwork and see if we can't straighten out the problem with your benefits." "After I change my underwear," Harris mumbled. "You were pretty fearless in there," Peter said, sitting at a nearby tea shop sipping a steaming bowl of matcha. "What? With Steve?" Aunt May waved a hand. "He's mostly bark. Very little bite. I've dealt with his outbursts before. He gets emotional. I can't say I blame him, but he always feels bad afterward. If it were someone I didn't know, I'd have taken a much more cautious tone. It's amazing the way you take the time to know the people who use the shelter. A place at a job like Beast is always about keeping the lights on. That's pretty much what's on everyone's mind all day, every day. But we can't forget why we're there. The point is not just to keep going, but to help people. When I start letting the people we serve suffer because I want to get back to the job, then I might as well find something else to do." Peter took another sip of the green tea. He loved its earthy flavor and wondered why he didn't order it more often. Oh, that's right. Because he was usually too busy to hang out at tea shops. The fact that he was only a few hours behind schedule with his aunt, instead of canceling entirely, meant that he was having a pretty good day so far. "I'm really sorry about this morning." "I know you're busy," she said. "And you've always been easily distracted. But your heart's in the right place. I never doubt that. Peter, So how are things at the lab? Peter gave her the rundown of the work and the latest updates concerning MJ, whom she adored. She listened and smiled and took genuine pleasure in hearing about his life. He wished he had the time to be a better nephew and far less irresponsible. He wasn't sure if he'd ever be as forgiving as Aunt May. As they walked back to the homeless shelter, Peter realized this was exactly what he needed. He'd been feeling so unmoored in his own life, wondering about what mattered, about where he was putting his energy. Then she reminded him. People were what mattered. His family, his friends, and MJ. Aunt May got it intuitively. The little problems and frustrations never seemed to distract her from what was important. He walked her back to her desk and was about to leave when a smiling man in an impeccably tailored suit approached them. "This must be the man I've heard so much about," the man said. Aunt May seemed to glow with pride. "Peter, I'd like you to meet Martin Lee, our benefactor." He'd heard a ton about Mr. Lee, mostly from his aunt. He was a self-made man who'd become one of the city's most successful businessmen. From what Aunt May had said, Martin Lee was essentially the anti-Fisk. Rather than wanting to wring money from suffering and trying to pretend he was a philanthropist, Lee was determined to give back to the city that had provided him with an opportunity to make something of himself. "It's great to meet you," Peter said. If there were more Martin Lees in the world, he thought, then there might not have been the need for a Spider-Man. "What you do here is so important. We wouldn't do much of anything here without your aunt," Mr. Lee said. "She holds this place together." She waved her hand again and laughed, but her eyes crinkled with pleasure. Raising him must have felt like banging her head against a wall, Peter mused. Now she had an opportunity to work hard and see the results of her labor. "Your aunt tells me you're quite the scientist." "I've been very lucky," Peter said. "I ended up working with a great innovator and I'm learning an incredible amount from him." "Gratitude is an important component of success," Mr. Lee said. "I'm sure you must be busy, but if you have any free time, consider volunteering a few hours here and there. I think you find it rewarding. And it will give you even more insight into how remarkable a person your aunt is." "I like that," Peter said. He wished he could commit right then and there, but he didn't want to let yet another person down. They shook hands again, and Lee walked into the back. "He seems like a good guy," he said to his aunt as he hugged her goodbye. "Oh, there's no doubt about that," she agreed. He had just enough time to get to the West Village to make the appointment with Harry Osborn. It wouldn't be long before Harry was off in Europe, and when he wasn't around, Peter would hate to think he'd missed the opportunity to spend time with his friend. They were meeting at the Coffee Bean, a place on Bleecker Street where they hung out since high school. Peter passed by a creepy old mansion that freaked him out when he was still young enough to wonder if the house might be haunted. Maybe he was still young enough because there was no way to look at the place without wondering if something supernatural was going on inside. Just as he reached the door, Peter checked his watch and saw he was still 2 minutes early. This was turning out to be a remarkable day. When he entered, he saw Harry already seated at the table, waiting for him. "I thought I finally beat you somewhere," he said, shaking his friend's hand. "And here I was kicking myself for being punctual when meeting you," Harry replied. "But you are actually early. The end times are upon us." Peter smiled and sat down. He learned to act like his unreliable was just as a goofy part of his personality, but there was no getting around the fact that Harry, like his aunt, thought of him as unreliable. "You caught up with MJ the other night." "Yeah, and she got the job at the Bugle." "I know," Harry said. "That's great, right? You must be thrilled for her." "I am," Peter said. "But I don't know. I get the feeling that there's something off between us right now. She seems kind of distant somehow." "Have you talked to her about it?" "We were going to talk last night, but—" Peter stopped himself. "I haven't. But you have, haven't you? You totally know what's going on, don't you?" Harry held up his hand palmed out. The three of them had been friends for years, and Harry had elevated third wheeling to a sublime art. He could be friends with both MJ and Peter, and each could confide in him. But they learned to respect that he had to protect himself from becoming a go-between. "Peter, if it were something you needed to hear from me, I would tell you," he said. "But I'm not going to play couples counselor." "But I heard your rates are reasonable." Peter made a conscious decision not to worry. Couples had disagreement all the time, and whatever was bothering MJ, they would work it through. He was determined to enjoy his time with his friend. Asking Harry about his travel plans, he allowed himself to relax and listen. When he'd been younger, it had been hard not to feel envious of Harry. Even now, the idea of picking up and spending months in Europe seemed like a fantasy. He couldn't even consider something like that. It wasn't because of the money, not that he had any, but because of the things that tied him down here in New York. He never considered walking away from his obligations, but the thought made for a nice daydream. They'd eaten lunch and were on the second coffees when the atmosphere in the restaurant seemed to shift. All conversations stopped at the same time. There were several gasps. Peter felt himself tense. He knew from experience how people responded when something terrible was happening. But at the same time, the spider-sense hadn't so much as twitched. Peter looked up and saw what had happened, and it was only the greatest effort that he kept himself from groaning. Norman Osborn, the mayor of New York City, and Harry's father, had just walked into the coffee bean.